Alright, so as I mentioned before, these are two action movies that were pretty much my two favorite movies growing up, like all through elementary school. I think around the 5th grade area, I actually called Demolition Man my favorite movie at that time. But back then, they did kind of have this reputation, and especially when they first came out, of them just kind of being taken at face value as another Schwarzenegger movie and another Stallone movie. And not only that, but they ended up coming out the same year also. Last Action Hero in the summer in like June, and then Demolition Man later in October. And they actually, one of the main theories I hear is one of the main reasons that Last Action Hero actually failed was that it came out the same weekend as Jurassic Park. Like its opening weekend, it might as well have been non-existent. And then as it went on, it was just kind of seeing they were the seemingly ultimate 90s action movies in the 90s, but then nobody really bothered to look past that, and they just went on to the next thing. Now, normally, this would be the kind of video where, like, I say, oh, but there's so much in it that you don't realize, and, oh, they should have a better reputation than they do. But luckily, that's already been happening recently, in, like, the last maybe few years or so. Where people have been rewatching these and addressing the fact that there's a lot more to them than just that, and they're very they were ahead of the game on a lot of stuff. And it's like particularly, I always go back to Last Action Hero when it seems like the whole self-awareness thing and the whole self-parody thing is just so incredibly common now. To the point that it's pretty much tired itself out, and it may have even tired itself out a long time ago. But like long before it was popularized, Last Action Hero had happened. And the same thing, pretty much the same thing with Demolition Man also, but certainly in different ways, because while Last Action Hero sort of predated the whole craze of everybody trying to be a parody of themselves and call themselves out, thinking it automatically makes them clever, because sometimes the trend goes that they just want to call themselves out and then leave it at that, and they think they're doing enough, when oftentimes they're not. They need to go a bit more deeper, and the writing needs to get a bit more clever, something I think, for the most part, Last Action Hero does accomplish. And while you could say the same thing about Demolition Man, there's also the whole thing about how people have kind of started addressing Demolition Man as sort of a prophecy, if you will, in a way, in certain aspects that we'll go into. But I think I want to start with Last Action Hero, because it's the one, like, I could probably tell you the vague area the first time I saw Demolition Man. I cannot Last Action Hero has just always been a part of my memory since I was like I would have been 2 when it came out. So I was probably about 3 or 4 the first time I saw it, which I couldn't remember. And since then, it has just been in my brain in its entirety forever. So it'll be interesting to sort of pick it apart and see some of the things I didn't see back then and didn't see for a while, because you sort of, when you see movies that many times in your childhood, they're so ingrained in your mind. It's like, it's weird how much the stuff that passed you by in your childhood will continue to pass you by, because the movie has already been ingrained as is in your mind. It's only when you kind of really start watching it closely, it's somehow you unravel these things that were always there in a movie you've always known. I know that sounds maybe a little too deep for something like Last Action Hero, even if you are acknowledging the great things that are kind of hidden in it or not so hidden in it. But yeah, that's pretty much been my experience with it. So I think the first thing that it does that sort of sets it above what you see nowadays in regards to like self-parody and calling itself out or whatever, is that it's not particularly condescending about the way that it calls itself out, because it's obviously essentially Schwarzenegger calling himself out. So it's going to be more like something ribbing itself rather than like being a scathing, commentary on the genre or whatever. So what I loved was that because when you go into this, for it to work as well as it does, you probably have to love the genre, because they're not gonna, like, really go after it in, like I said, a scathing way. So when you go into this, one of the first things you'll appreciate is even though they're using the Jack Slater movies to sort of make fun of Schwarzenegger and his cliches and just the action genre in general, especially at the time that it was, the Jack Slater movies are still movies that you kind of desperately want to see. Like, the Jack Slater movies look amazing. And and a lot of fans of the movie wish they existed, and I think that is something that really just immediately sets it apart from this whole parody craze that's been going on for the longest time. And I can kind of see where some people back then saw it as like because sometimes I struggle to call it subtle, but there's some stuff in there to where it is like they just there's that thing I was talking about where sometimes they try to subvert cliches and they end up just doing the cliches in a lot of cases. And sometimes that's in here, but I still feel like there's always kind of something under the surface that's aware of this, and there's usually one or two little things in there that show you they know what they're doing. When the Ripper's introduced. And it's supposedly the end of Jack Slater 3, but their entire conversation is like exposition. Exposition of the stuff that's already happened in the movie. So they're basically recapping the movie. You're in the middle, you're at the very end of watching. If Jack Slater 3 were an entire movie that we were seeing in this scene. And I feel like just the way that it immediately starts off with the climax of the movie, but at the same time, there are things in there that show you maybe Jack Slater 3 isn't such a cliche movie either. Like, for instance, the way that it apparently ends. So, because there's only... Because obviously we know what happens when he shoots the Ripper and the Ripper pulls Jack Slater's kid off the roof. We learn through flashbacks later. But between that happening and the middle of the credits, the only time period in between is how much time it takes Danny to leave the theater and go upstairs. Which we watch pretty much in real time, so it's like 30 seconds, if that. So I think we're supposed to assume that Jack Slater 3 just flat out ended with that shot we see. Like, it must have been the last shot of, like, Jack Slater looking shocked as he watches his kid plummet to his death. Which is something that's apparently barely addressed at the beginning of Jack Slater 4. So, but because it's also working with inside the movie itself. So, and also when you go in that, there's the whole thing about how that's sort of calling out how many, sequels we have, one right after the other. Obviously, that's been a thing since forever. And it's still, much as I love the Marvel movies, you can say it's a continuous thing still now. But this whole idea, unless I'm missing something, where Jack Slater 3 is out in theaters right now, and while Jack Slater 3 is still in theaters, Jack Slater 4 comes out tomorrow. So that's like I said, maybe there's something in there where like maybe this is Jack Slater 3 having maybe a re-release or it's just whatever, but I think it might be the joke that the sequels just come out that fast. And not only that, but we go right into the Hamlet scene, which kind of almost seems like it's going after trailers also. Which is something that's been, done here and there in, like, parody movies, particularly those, like the Kentucky Fried Movie and stuff like that kind of did stuff like that. But when you look at, like, sort of what people consider to be the ultimate parody of that is, like, say, the beginning of Tropic Thunder. But I feel like we had just as an effective parody of trailers with this Hamlet scene, where Danny takes the most ridiculous concept in his head by putting Jack Slater in, or I guess Schwarzenegger in Hamlet and making it this action movie, with the trailer guy voice. And once again, that's a movie I think we'd all want to see. And that's a strength I can't give enough credit. Also worth noting that Hamlet is introduced as one of the first action heroes by the teacher, and the teacher is played by Joan Plowright. And if I remember correctly, there's kind of an extra joke in there because Joan Plowright was the widow of Laurence Olivier. So there's like a sort of a loving ode when she's introducing him to the class, even though she's mentions his commercials. Still, I just like in the stuff like that you would never know unless you like know of the actors and actresses or whatever. So then going on the action itself, when I talk about this Jack Slater movies being movies we want to see, the great thing about that is that once Danny is inside the movie, it can pretty much do whatever the hell it wants because the whole thing of there's the real world and there's inside the movie, and it's like because it's such a thing now where everybody gets pissed off if something's not totally realistic. Like action movies can't go really over the top and above and beyond anymore because people complain that they're too unrealistic for some reason. So it's like the fact that they established the rules in both worlds means that once he's in Jack Slater 4, it can be a Jack Slater movie, and the fact that they don't necessarily call everything out, like after a while, there's sometimes they just let it be. I love that one of the first things Danny notices when he's inside the movie is that he can still hear the music. um, but that's the thing is there's like no constraints. Whether it be the action itself, or the shitty one-liners that he has, or whatever. But it's like, it gets to be the fun, dumb movie, as they call it. But the thing about that is, like, the fact that they're shedding light on their own weaknesses, when that's kind of a constant underlying thing, that it doesn't forget about. Because, like I said, that's what some of the worst of these movies do, where they try to be self-aware, but they just leave it behind after a while. And we always feel like it's there, and there's just enough time when the next time comes around that they'll address something that's, a weakness of the genre, or a cliche, or a trope, or whatever. So then it becomes fun to just watch, as long as we're inside the movie, watch whatever the hell happens, happen. And it can go as over the top as it wants to, because that's the rules of this world. But like I was saying also, the fact that it doesn't do that in a condescending way I think really helps also. And the fact that it can be really funny about it as well. Because like after a while, if they just address stuff, where it's Danny just providing commentary and saying, hey, this, would not happen in real life and this would happen in real life. He's like audiences today is what Danny's doing as he's in there. But then they make it funnier when Jack starts partaking in this. When they go to Vivaldi's house and Benedict comes to the door, the first thing he says to the butler is, it's a beautiful day and we're out killing drug dealers, are there any home? And then it's the way, even funnier to me, is when Danny addresses Benedict as the henchman with the glass eye. The way Jack just says, excuse me, are you a henchman? And there's something really insane about Benedict also. Yeah, this is the same scene with the dog pyramid, so, like, if you... we're just breaking all the rules intentionally, and it's amazing. But the great thing about Benedict also is that there's obviously a cliche in itself of the henchman turning on the main villain, and then the henchman becomes the main villain and all that. But there's something particular about Benedict where I sort of feel like, even though we see the resentful way Benedict feels about him, we keep getting cuts to him, I almost like to think that Benedict would not have become the main villain in Jack Slater 4 if Danny hadn't intervened. Like, if Danny hadn't come in and completely changed the chain of events that's supposed to happen, I feel like Jack Slater 4 would have been, like, a totally and completely different movie. There's, like, so many things that Danny gives him in this movie that I'm really even wondering how Slater would have gone from one place to the next in Jack Slater 4. But the thing about this is that it's kind of like the other side of that Big Trouble in Little China thing, where Kurt Russell is actually the sidekick to the hero, who's a side character, technically. It's like, I feel like we're always seeing, even though Benedict's just a henchman, we're always seeing the villain side of things from his perspective. Like, while Vivaldi's constantly doing his thing, we are always coming back to Benedict to, like, say Vivaldi's, an idiot. He's always saying the wrong phrases and all that. And it's like, we always end up on Benedict, like, we're seeing the whole thing from his perspective. And I think that's something that's outside of Jack Slater 4. I feel like that's Last Action Hero itself, showing us Benedict's perspective. So even though, we know he's in the mood because Danny says some of his lines back, but I still feel like, yeah, once Danny's inside the movie, then things just totally take another direction. That's the way I've always seen it anyway. Um, and then we go into some of the more serious stuff, like getting inside an action hero's mind when he has to start addressing things when they start not going the right way. When he like gets fired for good, which is something even the whole police station seems to not realize or expect. But when he goes home and like his house is practically empty, with the exception of the dude in the closet that he kills, and he has this whole existential crisis about when he almost realizes that he's in a series of movies. And it starts to get to him, like, because we watch action movies and we see their sequels and we're like, the stakes need to get higher and the hero needs to be put more in danger, and that's what we crave. And it's like, it's not being a proper sequel if it doesn't do that. And then you got Jack Slater here, like, saying, like, the villains are getting harder. Like, is it me? Am I not as good as I used to be? And it's like, it just seems to be getting worse, and I don't know how much longer I can do this. And he actually starts to really fear that he's, like, probably gonna die soon. But then, of course, Danny gives him the useful knowledge about only when the box office goes down. But until then. And then, yeah, and as I was saying, even once Danny's inside the movie, it's still kind of a kick-ass action movie. Particularly this massive funeral scene is crazy. And it just kind of goes on and on and on, but in a good way. And I know there have been people that complained about the length. But it's one of those things where I never noticed at all. And when I think back on it, and it's like, when I first realized how long it was, I couldn't believe it. Then the more I think back on it, it's like, well, there is a lot that happens in this movie, come to think of it. Especially with the whole segment when they get to the real world. But that's kind of the thing also is, oh yeah, another one of the things I love is, one of the side characters and the things that it points out is F. Murray Abraham, playing Jack's old friend, and immediately we know what direction he's going because Danny calls out the typecast. Using Amadeus of all the examples he could have used. And of course, ends up being right. And the whole thing when they have, they set up the fact that Danny's going to become his partner by showing the whole cliche thing of there's a whole like unit of this police station that does the partnering serious cops up with the unlikely partner, up to including the Danny DeVito cat and the superimposed Humphrey Bogart. And it's like that's something you could go through every single scene of this movie and point stuff out like that. It is like constant. And that's another thing that kind of keeps the whole self-referential thing alive, is it never runs out of material, even with how long it is. And then we get to the point where they even call out some of the cliches, like, in ways that aren't as blatant as the other ways. Once again, I struggle to say subtle, but they're not as blatant as the other things they call out. Like, there's just one line when it seems to be the whole thing about the parts that like women had in those kind of movies, the action movies in the 80s and 90s. And so there's the scene in the kitchen when he's been talking to Danny's mom all morning over breakfast, and the thing he says to Danny is, I've never just talked to a woman before. And it's like, that's the only way they address that, but it's like sort of the perfect way to just say that without it being too much of a thing, I guess. And so, speaking of that, there's the whole thing where they go from the movie into the real world. And the thing that I really like about this, and I guess you could say it's a credit to McTiernan with his direction, but you can sense, like, almost immediately, like, as soon as they open the theater doors and they're in New York, there's almost like this sort of bright bright aesthetic when they're inside the movie itself. That's like really contrasted when they come out. Like, you can actually sense a tone change as soon as they're in the real world. And just everything almost seems like to become grimier and darker, like mostly night scenes. There's like one day scene the whole time they're in the real world, and everything else is just like this really dirty looking night aesthetic, which I think really adds to that also. And so, as far as saying that Schwarzenegger is basically, ribbing himself, that could not have possibly come to more of a head than the fact that the climax of this movie takes place at the premiere of Jack Slater 4, where Schwarzenegger is going to show up with Maria Shriver and bring all of his Hollywood buddies with him, and there's going to be cameos galore at this premiere, and we get interactions between Schwarzenegger and Maria Shriver where she tells him, like, whatever you do, don't plug the restaurants. I can't stand it when you plug the restaurants. And the first thing he does is tell a reporter about Planet Hollywood and how amazing it is, the memorabilia they have, and all that. And then there's the whole... I did hear... like, not necessarily a theory, but an alternate version here that doesn't exist by any means. But somebody was saying that they thought there could have been something to this if they wanted to. Because I do think there's some genuinely serious beats in the last portions of this movie. But overall, it maintains its tone extremely well. The way it's able, like I was talking about, mainly the way it's able to be practically a comedy in the way it calls itself out, but also kind of a kick-ass action movie and at the same time, somehow. But then, once again, when Jack Slater realizes, he comes to the real world, realizes Arnold Schwarzenegger exists, he's just a fictional character, there's a whole existential thing. And the way they play with that, and kind of delve into those territories. Because if they didn't go in those territories, I could see people seeing it as unexplored territory, and they'd use that as a criticism against it. But I feel like it does it just enough to not entirely lose its tone. But one suggestion for a scene that I heard was somebody said, what would have happened, like, what would the outcome have been, what would Slater's reaction have been if he was at the Jack Slater 4 premiere and he ran into the child actor that played his son? What kind of interaction that would be and what his reaction to that would be. And that's where it's like, I like the idea and I like where your head's at, but that would have been a tonal shift we couldn't come back from. And I think if that crossed somebody's mind in the writer's room, I think they became aware of that and they were like, yeah, we should probably, we got the existential stuff, we should probably try and keep it as much as there is. Because there are a couple of big dramatic points here, a few dramatic points here in the climax that I like, but it's things that they don't necessarily address, like, right up front. Like when I was talking earlier about the fact that, it didn't feel condescending in the way it was sort of, making him the ultimate action hero and basically making a parody out of it. And the way I think it really shows that is that we have the other side of it, where we have the scene where the Ripper's thrown Danny over the side and he's hanging there, and this whole arc where Jack has to be a hero in the real world. I'm still not quite sure about the physics of him throwing Danny back on the roof, but for the most part, the idea is that he can still be a hero in the real world, and it's still in him, even when he was losing sight of himself in the fictional world. But then there's this whole moment when he confronts the Ripper again, and the Ripper decides to recreate the scene where Slater's son was killed. And interestingly enough, the movie has the restraint to not flat out say that's what's going on here. It's really just, like, you could just look at it and say it's the Ripper's thing. He kidnaps children, he takes them up to the roof, and that's what he does. And it's like, to see a villain like that in, like, an Schwarzenegger action movie is one of the other things where it's like, I really want to see these Slater movies. They sound pretty hardcore. But the whole idea that this is like the vengeance kill for his son. And it's like, Slater feels like he's failed a second time when he just chucks Danny over the side. And so there's like it's really fucking dramatic when Jack gets the axe in his hand and he's charging at the Ripper, because this is his chance to get that, because in Jack Slater 3, when he took Slater's son off the roof, he took him with him. And that fall probably killed him before Slater's bullet did. So he never got the chance to kill the Ripper for that. Because he died when he fell. So, and you could probably say the son's death was after the fact, so it was already a gone deal. So this is his actual chance to get that big revenge kill, and it's really... yeah, it feels nice and appropriately cold-blooded when he does so. And then there's the whole thing of Benedict practically killing him. Like he was that close to death, for real. And how dramatic and serious they play this, and how, like, actually bloody it becomes to show that, 'cause, like, in the moment, even though we know it's gonna all, come to a nice tight finish. There is a real sense of it there when Benedict is standing over him and says, you know, bad guys can still win, and I'm proof of it. And we really feel that in that moment. It is like so dire, and I love the way they really went for that. But then there's the other thing, where and that's another thing. Before we go on, is something that a lot of people thought was a lost opportunity, which I don't know how they ever would have done this. I don't know what people expected. I think the idea being there is more than enough. Because like I said, I like that he got the Ripper, an already established villain in the Slater series, because we have the whole he has to kill him for his son's death this time for real. Like even outside of the movie, that print of Jack Slater 3 can never be played again. So what we have here is this whole idea of Benedict's plan, where he's talking about all the movies he's going to go inside and all the monsters he's going to bring out. All the way down to Hitler. And it's like, I've always wondered if he was going to, like, you know, go inside a movie where an actor portrayed Hitler and bring Hitler back, or if he was going to actually go into, like, a Leni Riefenstahl movie and actually... and he's talking about King Kong, he's talking about Rosemary's Baby, Dracula, all of this stuff, Hannibal Lecter. And it sounds like some of the, like the most amazing shit in the world. But I've heard criticism that was... They said it seemed like a lost opportunity, and it's like, wait for Ready Player One or something. It was not going to be in this movie. And the establishment of Benedict being the guy that comes this close to killing him and is going to be the first villain that wins in a movie like this is more than enough of a great climax, I think. And bringing back the whole his glass eye has a bomb in it thing to do away with him is amazing. So... then we have one more ending, and I've heard a lot of complaints that a lot of people think it's way out of place, and I totally get where they're coming from, when it introduces the Seventh Seal, of all movies, so that the Grim Reaper can come out. In this particular case, he's played by Ian McKellen now, as opposed to the actor in the Seventh Seal, but... yeah, so there's a weird sort of crossover there. It's like Schwarzenegger fans go into this movie, and a lot of people saw it as any other Schwarzenegger movie. So it's like, I'm not sure who's picking up on the Seventh Seal thing here, or knows what that is, when they go see a Schwarzenegger movie in 1993. But then he comes to the theater, and he's getting ready to, I guess, take Jack, despite the fact that he doesn't do fiction. So I can see where people think it's pointless that this happens. But there is something about this scene, and maybe I'm reaching here, but I do think there's something very, very significant to this scene. And it may seem like it comes out of nowhere, but like I said, with the way we're, you know, going more and more into the serious angles of what this story provides, where it kind of goes past the parody point and does, like, actually explore some of those areas, with still the parody stuff, like I said, always being there, because even though this is totally and completely deadly serious that Jack Slater is about to die because he's in the real world and got shot in the real world, there's still something incredibly funny about the fact that the solution to this is going to be putting him back in the movie, because in the movie, that won't matter. Like, getting shot anywhere is like, oh, this is nothing. It's a flesh wound. That, even in this deadly situation, that concept that they're trying to pull off in the moment is really funny. It's just sort of drowned out by the seriousness of it right now. But the thing that I think is significant about the death scene, the Grim Reaper scene with Ian McKellen, is that this is like a big moment for Danny, because we've had Jack's big character arc where he becomes a hero in the real world, and he gets to take out his son's killer finally, and he's blown Benedict the fuck up. So Danny's arc here being, at the beginning of the movie, his mom is talking about the fact that she was a widow before she was 40, and that's why she and Danny are basically stranded and, you know, really, really poor, as the mugger told him. So the thing here is that his dad died when he was really young, so we can get a sense of the reason he's always at the movies, not only just because he loves movies like any of us do, but they're sort of the thing that's there for him because his dad isn't, and Slater sort of in that way also, especially with the way he bonds with Slater. It's like the closest he's ever been to a father figure, and now he's actually here in person in his life. But it's the line. So obviously he's trying to, stop that from happening. But it's specifically the line Danny says when he says, "I've had it up to here with you," when he sees the Grim Reaper. And it's like pulling a gun on death. It's not only just protecting Jack and, in a sense, his father figure, but also confronting the death that's already happened of his actual father. Uh, like I said, maybe this is a reach for a movie like Last Action Hero, but I feel like there's definitely something to Danny saying that line. Which, like I said, the movie has the restraint to not flat out say. He's not saying, he doesn't say the actual line, "You took one father from me, you're not getting this one," which is what a weaker movie would have done. Just him saying, "I've had it up to here," and you thinking you can take whatever you want, is like this real emotional confrontation, I think, about the death of his actual dad. So that's great. And yeah, you could say the mugger scene maybe adds to the length a little too much also. But I do think there's something to that in regards to... I get it that it can seem really pointless, but I do think, number one, it kind of just establishes the poor environment that Danny's in. It establishes the fact that it's the joke later where it's like he's in a real police station, and you see the contrast of when he's in the movie police station, and how they're nothing alike. But then there's also the fact that there's many moments in this movie where Danny kind of gets to be the hero of the movie he kind of always wanted to be. Particularly, if Danny was not controlling the crane, that funeral scene would have gone a totally different direction. And the fact that we see him just succumb to this mugger immediately, because he has no choice, and it makes him feel like small and weak. The fact that he gets to go inside the movie and be the big action hero he's always admired with Slater, I think is sort of that there's a reason that scene is in there to make that more of a payoff. So, yeah. So like I was saying, I do think there is more to this than just it being, a typical Schwarzenegger movie. But like I said, people have been addressing that finally, thank God. It took them long enough. And so, yeah, and like I said, especially when you have it to compare to the way parody and self-awareness is done today. Really makes it stand out, and you kind of see it as like a lot of the self-aware movies today wish they had some of the clever moments and the jokes and just the sense of humor about itself, but also respect for itself, that a lot of those are missing, and I think that's the main quality that makes this really work. So before we use up any too much more time, let's go into Demolition Man real quick, where we're getting not one, but two predictions for two different futures. Because obviously it came out in 1993, but the beginning of the movie is set in 1996, where the world appears to be burning, or at least the sort of LA and Hollywood area. Where one of the first images of the movie is the Hollywood sign burning and all that. And they say at the beginning, like, they don't even let commercial airlines fly into there anymore. They don't let them land there, because it's just total and complete fucking chaos. And the world has basically eaten itself at this point, or at least this portion of it. We never leave this city in the entire movie, so it's hard to say about the entire world, but here specifically, and that's the kind of thing, dude, that's what's so great about this movie's world building, is that something you don't really realize until you think about it. It's like, the movie feels so massive, and on a grand scale, it's like, this is the whole world and how it's changed. It's like, no, we're always in this one city, and we never leave it. So we don't know what it looks like on the outside, but, here... Yeah, and then we start off, and it starts off like any other action movie would. We introduce our good guy and our bad guy. And of course, our good guy is, yeah, the cliche action hero where it's like, he's the good guy, but he's also really violent and really reckless and really hard to control, and has the name Demolition Man for a reason. And he's going up against a more insane person than him. His "send a maniac to catch a maniac" line, which is actually a pretty good action movie line for the early 90s. And it's because it sets up the whole concept itself in one-liner. Especially when we're introduced to Wesley Snipes, who it's built up as... He builds up that it's Simon Phoenix. I know it is. I just have a hunch. His hunch goes so far, he just screams his fucking name on the way down. It's like, that would have been embarrassing if it wasn't him. But of course it's him. And we get glimpses of him that show us his whole character in these little details before we actually even see his face. We see his knife with the skull on it, we see his blonde hair, we see his Beetlejuice pants and his 90s jacket. And it's like, I feel like we already know, and we know the guy's played by Wesley Snipes. I feel like we already know so many things about this character and how fucking over the top and insane and glorious he's going to be. And sure enough, this opening scene, where everything is just so gloriously over the top, they're talking about these passengers that we never see, that he's trying to save, these bus passengers on a bus that he hijacked, and the reveal of it later, that by the time Spartan shows up to this scene, they're already long dead. And like, when you know that going into this scene, it makes him seem so much crazier, that he's already done the thing. When this opens up, because the whole movie's based on the fact that they were supposedly still alive when the building exploded. Spartan's responsible for that. So all of this, so what I'm trying to say here is that Simon Phoenix is one of the greatest action movie villains probably ever. And so we have this whole thing where we have this tense standoff. There's the whole thing where like the gas is under him and he's got the torch. A scene that's sort of mirrored in his last moments also. But then you've also got this moment where he, like, turns the torch on and off, and it's enough to trigger Spartan to pull his gun out. And it's, like, just this between them, and then it culminates in this, you know, fight where they beat the holy shit out of each other that ends in this massive, massive explosion. And everything I just said is before the opening credits. And I think it's, like, in a less than 10-minute window. So with that as our opening, it's like, this is going to be what the movie is. And typically movies would let us down, and it's like, I want this to be the whole movie, but it would do other things. And while it has so many other things that it's going on, it's got commentary on itself, and it's got the whole future thing going on, and it's all introducing all this other stuff, having so much fun with its concept itself. Yeah, basically the two of them beating the shit out of each other still feels like it's the entire movie, and that's great. Like, that's what we want. With this setup, that's what we want. So when we go into it, there's the whole thing of seeing him escape. When I talk about him being one of the best villains ever, it's like he's already had one great introduction, but then we basically get another introduction. Like, we could completely take out the opening scene of this movie, and just start with them already being in the cryo prison, and this scene would have been just as effective of an introduction to Simon Phoenix as the opening scene is, where he's brought out. And the warden, who is Andre Gregory of all people, as in My Dinner with Andre, is the warden that he attacks and uses his eyeball to escape. Like I said, as over the top as possible, just right away, to the point that this could have been an intro in itself. And then the way that a murder has not happened since 2010, so they're alerted every single time a person is killed. And they're powerless to stop it because they're not trained to handle this, because the future is so non-violent by this point. And the whole sequence of them watching, like, the trail of bodies he leaves, to the point that that's the only way they can track him. They have to wait for him to kill somebody else so they can find where he is. It's just this real... Like, you can imagine it from their perspective, and it's, like, it's kind of horrific. When you think about the world that they've been... You know, that they've grown into. And the fact that he almost seems like this monster from another dimension that can just kill people like that in a world that is unheard of. And it's amazing. And still be, like, hilarious, too. In the way that he does it. Like, it's not even intended to be that horrific. I just feel like it accidentally, effectively comes off that way. But it's also just as hilarious when we see his different interactions, and he's starting to realize that he's been programmed, and he's doing shit that he does not realize he can do. And the way Snipes plays it, almost as if... Snipes almost plays this movie. He's playing one of the best villains ever in an action movie, but it's also like he's almost going entirely comedic about it. Like, he's playing the movie like he's in a fucking comedy. and that still adds to it, because it shows... it's what they say later on, which is also what makes him such a great villain, is they're saying... Not only is he doing this horrific stuff, but the baffling thing is, it's fun for him. And it's like that, and that comes through so much in his performance, and it's amazing. And then, of course, you bring out Stallone, who's basically, once again, like Schwarzenegger kind of was in Last Action Hero, is more or less having to play, like, when you see the contrast between him and this world, the way he handled things, like, in the background of that 1996 Los Angeles, it's like he just sort of blended in, and it's like he went in with his environment, and that's how he was. In this world, it's like he just looks ridiculous to react to things like that. And it's sort of like, it's almost like it calls out how ridiculous, some of the movies and some of the parts and stuff like that ended up being with him. But once again, kind of shown in this obviously, homage sort of way, because it's still a kick-ass action movie. And they never get away from that, just like Last Action Hero did. To the point that we've got, like, the fact that they program him to be a seamstress when he comes out. So it's like, we have this ultimate action hero called the Demolition Man, who will kill anybody and everything that's doing wrong around him. But he's also like an expert seamstress at the same time, and it's something that is now forever incorporated in him. And sort of stripping some of that away from him without him having to become a different character, which is really great. And then the way they call some of that stuff out, like when he's talking to Bill Cobbs and they're catching back up, and he's just being Spartan from the 90s. And I think it's Benjamin Bratt says, like, is that really the way they interacted? And she just casually says, yes, this is the way insecure heterosexual men react to each other. It's like it just slips that line in there and just really calls itself out, but just so sort of nonchalantly. And so I think that's the best way to do it. Like, the fact that they don't dwell on the things they're calling out, I think is what really helps and takes it a long way. And like I said, the way we see the future depicted through a lot of its characters, like the Benjamin Bratt character I was talking about, where it's like, he just goes after these people with minor offenses, even though they're supposed to be like cops, and he's like, oh no, I find my job very fulfilling. Benjamin Bratt in this movie reminds me of like one of the aliens in Galaxy Quest. And then we have Rob Schneider. One of the things where it's like the camera's just panning by as it's showing us what the police station looks like. And as we pan by Rob Schneider, he like answers the phone and he's like, if you'd like to talk to an automated response, press whatever. And it's like instead of the other way around where it's a computer asking you if you'd rather talk to a human. It's like it does all these things like in just one shot or two to really establish just how much has changed and what exactly is going on here and why it's so significant. Why it's such a significant contrast to unleash people like John Spartan and Simon Phoenix into this world. Where, like I said, there's even a sort of like inherently comedic setup in that, as well as an awesome action one. So yeah, and then I guess we'll go ahead and go into this. The whole thing about a lot of people seeing this as sort of like prophetic about the way it sort of, because when it came out, the whole idea was that it was like a satire and commentary on like, the time of the 90s, and it was like just showing stuff like not just like we were talking about all those things about like not just in the movies it was calling out and the cliches it was calling out, but just kind of the time period in general. And that's basically what it was released as, and that was the idea. But now that we're like further down that road and getting closer to 2032, when the movie's eventually set, there's the whole thing where people have started to call out that it's almost like it's gone into that sort of thing where like people seem to be getting more and more sort of sensitive thing, and it's like people like to say, this is the direction we're headed. We're actually going to be this whole thing where, like, it's... I mean, when you see the call-out stuff, like, on Twitter and stuff like that, and people trying to take every single little tiny thing into their own hands and get this sort of, get everybody in trouble for, like, even the smallest thing. And once again, though, there's the whole argument where it's like... Because Stallone has this whole thing at the end that sums up everything. When he's talking to Dennis Leary and the Scraps, and he's talking to Bob Gunton and the cops, and it's like, nobody is completely and entirely wrong here, but you guys need to get your hands dirty a little bit, and you guys need to maybe clean up a little bit and settle the fuck down, and come to some sort of middle ground here. Because it's like, it's the constant, they think it's one thing, they think it's one other thing, and it's like, let's try to bring this together a little bit and find we need a little of this and a little of that. to the point that it almost especially seems prophetic in the sense that it is the being fined a credit, the running joke throughout the movie. Like in the future, it is literally illegal to say certain words. It's like you can see where people do sort of get that vibe from it. And like I said, the way it sort of calls itself out also, and then the whole thing about how it's like when people say like, oh, things weren't as sensitive back in the day and all that, and the way they talk about, like I said, in the sense of an action movie, they're saying like, yeah, the 90s was more like a Wild West thing, and you could do whatever you want. There was more freedom to do whatever you want, and then this one is much more contained, and people are, fined and put away for whatever. And Raymond Cocteau has basically made this. It's a world that's so perfect. It's got a shitload of problems, and it's sort of the wrong way to go. And it's like it's sort of showing you that whole we don't want things to be too perfect because then there's way too many things holding us back. And it's like what's the line where I think Spartan says something on the lines of like you can't take away somebody's right to be an asshole or something like that. I think it's right after the Scraps sort of attack, and he realizes that the Scraps have been built up to be like this big underground thing that's going to come up and like take over the. You see the territory we're going into. They're being built up as this really, really dangerous thing. These really deadly, dangerous people, and the police build them up as like this ultimate. Raymond Cocteau especially is like, we need to kill Dennis Leary before he rises up and starts a revolution and takes us all out. And then Spartan attacks them and realizes they're just hungry people, and that's about it. And yeah, Leary's got like his soul. He gets his trademark Dennis Leary rant and all that. But yeah, it's stuff that's in there that it's weirdly sort of mirrors it in the way that it's like when movies become dated, especially movies like this, and it's almost like the opposite is happening to it. There's even that moment where it's like, to say that Simon Phoenix sort of represents just the chaotic attitude of the 90s itself, and you talk about things that you can't do or jokes that you can't make anymore. A lot for good reason. Like, and which is why I'm using this example. And it's something I'd never really noticed until very recently. It's when Phoenix first shows up at the museum, and he goes up to that little, like, podium that shows you where all the stuff in the museum is. And he, like, makes that sound. And for the longest time, like, really for the longest time, until, like, the last couple of times I've watched it did I realize this, I assumed he was, like, making fun of, like, he was mocking, like, the chattering of the intercom. But it was when I looked closer that I realized in that moment there was, like, a group of Asian kids that walk by him. And he looks over at them, and he's making the stereotypical, like, Chinese sort of thing. And I never even realized that. I thought he was mocking the intercom guy, and then I realized he's making fun of Asian kids just because. Just so he can have a reason to chuckle to himself. And it's like, even in that sense. So yeah, I can buy that. But another thing that's almost like kind of eerie is take away the stuff like that, and you talk about stuff that the movie was prophetic about. There's a couple of things about the cryo prison where they got one thing wrong, but then they got something really weirdly right. And that is, at the end, when he's gathering up the worst people he can find, not giving them the rehab, and that's going to be his army, after he thaws them out. Sort of in the way Benedict was going to bring out the monsters. It's one of those things where it seems like a great idea, but the villain's vanquished before that can happen. One of the people he wants to thaw out is Jeffrey Dahmer. But it's like, the movie didn't know that he would have already been dead by the 1996 opening, let alone the 2032. But on the other side of that, at the very beginning, when they're going through and they're looking at the prisoners' names, seeing the last murders that took place back in 2010 or whatever, one of the murderers is a guy named Scott Peterson, which is just a name they threw in there. Almost a decade before the really famous murder case involving the dude named Scott Peterson, who killed his wife. And I know Scott Peterson's like a really sort of basic name, so it's not too out of the realm, but it's a little eerie. Like it's addressable at least. So yeah, so all that aside though, and there's so much to appreciate about the fact that you can see it as both it was calling itself out about the '90s, and that it's still kind of being able to do that while living in 1993 physically is pretty insane, and I really really appreciate that. But there are also times where I'm just a simple person, and there's not a whole lot I need from a movie. And this movie was like, I think the reason it was my favorite movie when I was a kid, when I was like in 5th grade, was the fact that it was everything I needed in an action movie. A good guy and a bad guy constantly fighting each other. And a good guy that was, crazy off his ass, and a good guy that's also crazy off his ass, but is also, and it's just this great combination of things. And there are 4. Usually it's like one scene in the middle, maybe, and then a climax. This has 4 extended scenes throughout it of Stallone and Snipes beating the fuck out of each other. 4. That's a lot for a movie under 2 hours, and a movie that's this big and has this much action. You've got the opening scene. You've got the museum shootout. I fucking love. The museum shootout might be one of my favorite action scenes. It's not, like, necessarily really huge and really over the top, and it's got the one-liners in it and all that, but I just love how straightforward it is. It's like the culmination of everything I love about this movie, where it's like, it's got all this great stuff in it. You can see it as this commentary thing, past and present and potentially future. And all this stuff, and the, almost like a class system thing as well. And it's like, but at the same time, there's such a simplicity to the main plot, like the setting point of good guy versus bad guy. And that's exactly what it is. After the museum shootout, we get the car chase. And then after the car chase, we get the big-ass climax. I fucking love the fight at the end of the movie in the cryo prison. And it's like the whole, it goes through every layer of it. It starts off with Phoenix shooting at him with the old style guns he got from, the scraps or from the museum, and then he upgrades to the futuristic guns, and then when both those things fail him, they just go old school and beat the fuck out of each other until one of them dies. And dies in the most wonderfully amazing creative way possible. All the way going back to Phoenix even says at the beginning, I'd forget my head if it wasn't attached. And sure enough, incredible payoff. Yeah, and then you look at that, and that's the thing too, is you think about him building an army of these prisoners, or him going down and, like, he's got, like, Jesse Ventura and all them after a while. But yeah, as far as good guy versus bad guys go, he's got, Spartan's got the whole police force on his side, and he's slowly getting there. He's, like, Bullock obviously is that great character that's stuck in the past, like, is really obsessed with the 20th century and Lethal Weapon and stuff like that. But the fact that there's, like, this whole... He's got a whole force behind him regardless. Simon Phoenix is one dude acting... Yeah, he's under control of Cocteau, but for just one reason. Like, just to kill Edgar Friendly. But as far as causing complete and total and massive chaos, that's all him. Just one person that Spartan has to go after. And so when this all comes down, like, it's not... I mean, at the end, he has a few guys to take out. He and Huxley have to work together. But when it comes to the big confrontations, it's always just down to the two of them. And I think there's just something so appealingly old-fashioned about that, especially given that it's a movie that's set in the way future. That's, like, that whole contrast is, like, the whole point. And it's executed incredibly. And then you look at it, like, the production design to do all the futuristic stuff is amazing, the ideas behind it, the effects, all that stuff. And then, like I said, we just get our nice little wrap-up where it's like, Stallone spells everything out and says, like, you people and you people, let's try to, compromise here, for God's sake. Because neither of you are completely right, but neither of you are completely wrong either. So let's try to do this. So yes, and it ends in a nice bookend of Stallone running out of an exploding building, doing that same yell, and in the first instance he's got Phoenix over his shoulders. The next, he doesn't, for clear reason. So I always like that also. So it's kind of this sort of finalized thing. And we end on our seashells joke, of course. One of the most famous things, if not the most famous thing about the movie. It's weird how an action movie can have so many running jokes in it. So yeah, so Last Action Hero is the movie that was ingrained in my brain at a very early age, to the point that I can't even remember the first time I laid eyes on it. But I feel like there's something more, I don't know, because I do like the way that they're about equal in the way they go into the things they went after. But you could say Demolition Man almost has the unfair advantage of being able to call out what some people to believe almost the entire future. But at the same time also, there is the self-aware thing that's really exploded. The Last Action Hero is an early example of. But I think between these two movies, Demolition Man is the one I'm most likely to go back to. So yeah, I think its action might be a bit better in the way just the whole thing between Spartan and Phoenix and the clashes that they have, and just how they're just that ultimate good guy versus bad guy thing. I think is probably why it might stand out to me a little more. But yeah, so that's what we have with these. I have no idea what the next one is, but the next review video is going to be the Goldfinch and Hustlers, and probably one more thing. So, and then whatever else. So I think Ad Astra and Rambo, again, are the week after that, and Downton Abbey. So that's a very odd week. And then we'll just kind of go from there. So I think this has been gone for about an hour, so we'll end like right now. So until whatever the hell's coming next, that's it.